Hey, good people, and welcome to our lecture today, where we are going to start off covering some information in chapters 1 and chapters 2 in regards to social problems and social theories. So let's go ahead, buckle up, and let's get started. You are in this class, Soc 200, Contemporary Social Issues, because you have already completed the Introduction to Sociology, which is great. And in that course, if you reflect back in Intro to Sociology, you were introduced to a lot of different concepts and just actually the foundation of different topics and issues that could be presented and discussed in detail when we talk about social problems or social issues. And so in chapter 1 of our text, chapter 1 kind of reviews some of that with us and just getting us back in tune with our sociological perspective and looking at things through our sociological lens. So it kind of reviews some terminology with us. Excuse me, and it walks us through this whole idea of how are we establishing or how do we begin the conversation about social issues or social problems. It begins with talking with us or refreshing information in regards to looking at things from an individual's perspective. And if you recall back in Soc 100, you may have learned that one sociological paradigm, symbolic interaction. And symbolic interaction is all about, excuse me, getting an understanding or having an interpretation of how someone is making sense of what's going on around them. So when we talk about looking at sociology from the individual perspective, it does not escape us, or it should not escape us, that there is a lot more that goes on with this individual and the way that they identify an issue as a problem, because we go from the individual on down to the individual and how they function in society. And when we think about how folks function in society, we have to know that people are not living in an island in and of themselves. We do have contact one with another. So when we're looking at the individual and we're looking at the individual in society, we have to look at the different variables that may exist that one may be having some interaction with or through. So we got to look at it related to families, communities, businesses, organizations, excuse me, schools and education. All of that leads to, again, the way that I begin to make sense of what's going on around me. Now, when we're looking at, again, someone's interpretation of social functioning, we also cannot ignore that there will be and there are some historical relevance as well as economical relevance when we talk about social issues and social problems. Now, we're not going to be having so much as a history course. No, 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 no. We're not going to go back to U.S. History 1 and 2. However, we don't want to ignore the information that we may have gained from U.S. History 1 or 2, because the information that we gain, that historical perspective, also gives us a peek into the cultural expectations, the social norms of how folks interacted, how they saw themselves, and how they made sense of what was going on around them. And when we think about, again, the economical impact, the historical impact, all of this relevant to how someone, that symbolic interaction, how I'm making sense of the world around me, we get into this issue where we begin to think about, if I am observing someone, okay, this type of research that we call field observation, I am observing behavior. And I'm not interfering with what someone may be doing on a daily basis, but I'm just observing and I'm making note of how they may react, how they may interact. Sometimes we base our judgment or our interpretation, so to speak, on preformed ideas or preformed thoughts. And some may go as far as to say some prejudicial thoughts. Now, hold on, good folks. Don't get all excited about nothing. When I talk about prejudicial thoughts, I mean we have prejudgments already made. Excuse me. When I'm talking about the prejudgments kind of lead us into the direction of stereotyping people and behaviors. Stereotyping folks that we've already put in small boxes, again, so that we can kind of make sense of how I'm going to interact with them or how I interpret their behavior. You already have them in a small box, and within that box there is an expected behavior, and when that expectation is not met, we begin to stereotype, which means that we begin to put maybe some negative expectations, or we begin to view them in a negative way because it doesn't meet our initial expectation. We're talking about stereotyping. We're talking about that prejudgment that we have. When we're looking at studying the way folks function in society, when we start looking at social functioning in and of itself, we have to push ourselves beyond what we may already think, beyond our comfort zone. It's time to buckle up, good people, because we got to go beyond the foundation. What mommy, daddy, grandma, grandpa, auntie, uncle may have taught us, we got to go beyond that. And we begin to view things based on our sociological imagination. Go back to Social 100 if you need to when we started or when we were introduced to that, but there's a good explanation, a good refresher in chapter 1 when we talk about our sociological imagination. This sociological imagination, it pushes us to begin to see things critically, to think beyond what we may already believe, things that we may already hold true in our perspective, but it pushes us to go to the next level, to think about things and to view things from a sociological perspective. And that's what we're going to be doing throughout this semester. When you're reading the textbook, you're going to see a lot of information, basic information on specific social issues, but I'm going to encourage you to go beyond what you may already be thinking. I'm going to encourage you to do some research and share it with the rest of us, whether it be small video clips, whether it be a magazine or a newspaper article that's relating to the topic that we're talking about, that's going to push us to think about what we're thinking about and to view things from, again, that sociological perspective. All right, y'all, it's going to be good stuff, good stuff. Again, when we're wrapping up, excuse me, when we're wrapping up chapter 1 and we're talking about looking at things from our sociological perspective, we want to make sure that we are engaged in the process of distinguishing between fact and interpretation. Okay, because that's where it gets a little tricky, y'all. Go back to Social 100 when we talked about, or we were introduced to research, and we know that there are variables. We have some independent variables and dependent variables. Our independent variables are always going to be those things that can stand separately and still be defined as an individual item. The dependent variable is going to be the outcome. The independent variable, when we put those things together, they create a change. The change is the dependent variable. So when we talk about distinguishing between fact and interpretation, we got to be really willing, ready, and mindful of how things may change if we manipulate the variables, or if the variables are manipulated. And I'm hoping that makes sense, y'all. So that's just a quick overview of chapter 1. And now let's go ahead and move on into chapter 2. Moving on into chapter 2, good folks, chapter 2 begins to explore social theories. And I can already hear the sighs. I already see the eyes rolling. Yes, I can see y'all. Because when we talk about theories, it can be daunting sometimes, yes. Excuse me. But I want you to have this understanding that when we talk about looking at sociological theories, we are looking at the foundation, something that's giving us a foundation and giving us a little bit of a direction in how we may begin to explore an issue, or I should say an issue that started out as an individual problem, and how we explore that as it becomes a social problem or a social issue. So when we think about our sociological theories, excuse me, good people, I'm sorry, I keep coughing and choking. Forgive me for that, but bear with me if you don't mind, please, and thank you. But when we talk about our sociological theories, we have to know that there are 3 common themes that the sociological theories give us. The first one is looking at the nature of the person, of the individual that may be functioning within the social issue. What's going on for that person? Again, from that symbolic interaction perspective, how are they making sense of what's going on around them? The second one is the basis for the social order. How is society functioning in regards to the way that person, that individual, may see themselves in society? How is society functioning? What is the social order? We got to think about that based on social norms, based on the culture, different things, again, that factor into that. The third thing is that we have to look at the situation or the circumstances that could invoke some type of social change. Excuse me. When we consider that, again, the situation or circumstances, that's where we come into play with our variables. What is it that is standing out, that's standing or could stand separate in and of itself and still represent something? What happens if an element of that changes? How will that change impact the outcome? So when we're talking about theories, again, we just have to have an idea and clarity of the foundation that we may be standing on or that we may be following as we explore social problems. So the theories that we're going to be looking at in our theorists kind of all revolve around the paradigm of structural, functional, and social conflict. And I'm hoping you guys remember that. That would be our macro perspective, looking at the whole picture. So when we excuse me, as we begin to look at some theorists, it's going to kind of be intermixed here, but make sure you read through your textbook to get a full understanding of the theorist and the theory that they worked with or that they presented, because I'm just going to be giving you a brief overview of them. So the first one that we're going to look at is Karl Marx. Karl Marx would be that theorist that fell under the paradigm of social conflict. And when we talk about Karl Marx looked at analyzing society from an economic perspective, looking at the haves versus the have-nots, the bourgeoisie versus and the proletarians. Karl Marx was one that said that there's something that's going on in society that is making us function in a way that those that have always want to have, and those that have not are always fighting to gain what those have may have, if that makes sense. So what Karl Marx was looking at when analyzing society is he looked at possession, who has what. He looked at the means of possession, how did they get what they have. And the third thing he looked at is the consequences, hold on to this, good people, the consequences of the uneven distribution. The consequences of uneven distribution. That can go a long way when we talk about social conflict. I have loaded for you all to view for this chapter 2 very interesting videos. One that's introducing you to, well, actually, I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me hold on. Let me put a pin in it, y'all, because I'm getting excited. But there are 2 videos that I want you to look at that are actually going to take you a little bit further when we talk about the consequences of uneven distribution of power. Ooh, it makes me all giddy on the inside. Excuse me, but that's Karl Marx. So the next theorist that we're going to talk about is Emile Durkheim. Emile Durkheim, he would fall under our structural functional perspective. Emile Durkheim was a French sociologist who studied the way society came together, the bits and pieces in society that made sense as they came together, but also they may have produced an outcome that may not have been favorable. If you reflect back to Social 100, you may recall that Emile Durkheim was that sociologist that studied suicide. And why do people commit suicide? And he had some very interesting variables that he attested to that. So again, that's Emile Durkheim looking at the bits and pieces that make society function, but also the bits and pieces that help hold society together. The next theorist that we're going to look at is Max Weber. Now, Max Weber, under that functionalist perspective, his whole idea was about functioning or focusing on the interpretive part of research, interpretive sociology. And by interpretive, Max Weber was looking at gaining an understanding of the purpose or the motive of the reason society was functioning in the way that it did. The purpose and the motive of how we may have an understanding of social functioning, of how we may choose to interact in society. So that's our guy, Max Weber. We have 2 other people that's coming up that fell under social conflict. The first one is W.E.B. Du Bois, or W.E.B. Du Bois. He studied race conflict. Excuse me. He is a Black sociologist, and he studied racism in the United States. And looking at what is it that's creating the division. When we get into talking about race and ethnicity in later chapters, we're going to talk about what exactly does race mean in the United States and also globally. The other sociologist or theorist under social conflict is Jane Addams. Jane Addams, my girl. She was one of the leaders in the Settlement House movement. She was one of the founders of Hull House with her colleague Ellen Starr. Jane Addams was a sociologist or a theorist who said, you know, when we're talking about social conflict and inequality, we can't just put a Band-Aid on whatever the issue may be. No, 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 no. We have to find out the root cause of what the issue may be. So with Jane Addams, her whole mission by working through the Hull House and, or I should say Hull House in Chicago, the Settlement House movement, was that she did not want to provide services to individuals or a community and not be a part of. So Jane Addams, together with Ellen Starr, her colleague, they when they had Hull House, they lived within the community that they provided services for, so that they had a better understanding of the barriers, but also of the successes of those that they were providing services for. Excuse me. So that's kind of a quick rundown of the theorists when we're looking at structural, functional, and social conflict. We have to know that under the structural functional perspective that we're looking at, again, the way the bits and pieces are coming together and impact or affect the way society functions. So when we're thinking about how society functions and we're exploring, again, this whole idea of the way someone makes sense of the world around them, we have to look at it, again, from that sociological lens, from their perspective. How is society functioning based on this issue that they may be dealing with? For example, we know that right now in our society we are dealing with a pandemic, and the government had tried to assist folks who were out of work by increasing unemployment benefits. Great. That is great for those who were able to utilize that service. But now we have to ask ourselves, as we get closer to this time when unemployment benefits will be, that extra, I should say, will be expiring, how are folks going to continue to make sense of what's going on around them? Because we have to know, we have to realize that some folks that were receiving the extra funds, they may have used them as a savings to create a safety net. Good choice. Some may have used it to purchase things that they've always wanted. Not saying that's a bad thing, but it's the best thing. So as we're thinking about the way society functions and these funds getting ready to dwindle away, how am I going to make sense of surviving beyond this if I don't have a job and I still am claiming unemployment, if I used it as a safety net, trying to create a nest egg, or if I spent it all and I don't have anything to live on? Structural, functional. How are we putting pieces together to make sense of the way I'm interacting in society or how society is functioning? We also see that when we're talking about structural, functional, and that unemployment, we also see that being played out with the business industry and folks looking for employees and the incentives that they are providing, how it impacts the way we make sense of the world around us. And I'm hoping that makes sense, good people. So that's that structural functional perspective. When we get into that social conflict, this is where I almost got ahead of myself earlier. Excuse me. When we talk about that social conflict, under social conflict, there's several different layers, I guess we could say, or other theories that fall underneath that. The first one is the feminist theory. And we look at that inequality in society based on gender. And again, we're going to get into that into a later chapter, but just an introduction here to this one, that feminist perspective kind of also introduces us to this whole idea of, or the concept of, intersectionality. And when we talk about intersectionality, we're looking at that from the feminist perspective as inequality as a female, but also inequality based on occupation, inequality based on education. How is that impacted the way that I make sense of the world around me? The other theory that falls under social conflict, excuse me, is the critical race theory. And I know, good people, I know we have been inundated with that over the past couple of months. but we are going to explore that even a little bit further in the later chapter. But when we talk about critical race theory, what does that mean? What does critical race theory mean in the way that I make sense of the world around me? When we talk about critical race theory, we're looking at, again, making sure that we have an understanding of the importance that race plays in the way that our society functions, according to cultural norms. So the critical race theory is not so much saying, ooh, we want to deny, or ooh, we want to highlight, but it is saying, hey, from that historical perspective, we have to have an understanding of that is just part of the foundation and our societal norms here in the United States. And I'm hoping that makes sense. So with that being said, let me wrap this up by saying, or reminding you that I did post 2 additional videos that I'm going to ask you all to watch. The videos are relating to your identity, how you see yourself, based on that sociological imagination, but also based on some of the elements that feed into the way we make sense of the world around us. How do I identify myself based on my race, my age, my gender, my socioeconomic status, my education? How do I define myself within my own family, within my circle of trust or my friend group? How do I define myself when I'm interacting with my colleagues? How do I define myself? That's also going to be part of your, or one of your assignments with this week, is looking at how you define yourself. But okay, good people, so this is chapter 1 and chapter 2. Just a refresher on what it means to study society and social functioning. Chapter 2, a refresher on our theories that we look at, excuse me, and the theorists that we'll see repeated throughout the textbook. Emile Durkheim, Max Weber, W.E.B. Du Bois. One I did not mention was Talcott Parsons. And who was our last one? Karl Marx. Karl Marx. All right, good people. And then actually there will be other ones to follow. Herbert Spencer, all of those good folks that you may have been introduced to in Intro to Sociology. All right, good people. So that's going to put a wrap on this lecture. I encourage you now to watch those other 2 videos that are posted on the college's LMS page, and then proceed with the assignment and the discussion posts. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, y'all know how to get a hold of me. Love, peace, and bacon grease.